Good morning, everyone. Are you all awake? Are you sure? As Danny mentioned, where have I focused my career? As Danny mentioned, I'm right now the Senior Director of UX at Acquia. Before that, I was leading up the UX team at Carbonite. I've spent my career, and when people ask me what I do, I am leading up UX teams, but really what I focus on and what I tell people is that I'm like this woman. Not just like Sigourney Weaver, obviously. I'm not an actress, but when I talk to people about what I do, I've spent the bulk of my career watching people interact with technology. The first research study I ran, dating myself a little bit now, was in 1997. And unfortunately, the bulk of my time is spent sitting down with people, interacting with websites and products, and struggling. Why am I like Sigourney Weaver? Thinking back to Gorillas in the Mist, as Sigourney played Diane Fossey, I sit down with people, I watch them interact, whether it's with websites or products or with their traditional workflow, and I see where they're having problems. Now, a question for all of you. For the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be talking about UX research. How many of you have conducted a usability test with a user on your site? Okay, about half of the room. How many of you have gone out into the field and seen what your users are doing? Okay, a handful of people now. My one goal out of this session, as we talk after the session, my hope is any of you who haven't raised your hands will have enough confidence and actually want to run some research of your own. So I'd love you to come up to me after the session and challenge me to see if I've accomplished that goal. I wanted to start and have you meet Doug Dietz. You know, I mentioned that I've spent the bulk of my career conducting UX research. A lot of people will ask me why. Why do I spend so much time sitting down with users? For those of you who have never seen this man, some information to know about him. He's the principal designer at GE Healthcare. His role at GE, if you've ever had to have an MRI scan or a family member of yours has been in one of those huge MRI scanners, Doug Dietz is responsible for designing those scanners for all of GE. A couple of years back, Doug went into a hospital because he had spent 2.5 years of his life designing the new version of the MRI scanner. He was thrilled with the industrial design of this scanner. This is the scanner that Doug designed. And he went into a hospital that was installing this scanner because he really wanted to see, how easy the installation process was for the hospital. So as he's there, he's thrilled that the installation process was simple. At some point as they were installing, they asked Doug to leave the room and go out in the hallway for a bit. And as he left the room, he saw a little girl with her two parents walking up to this room with the MRI scanner, and she was screaming at the top of her lungs. And her parents were trying to calm her down. And what Doug heard the parents say is, remember, we told you that we were going to have to go through this. We asked you, can you please be a brave girl for us today? Now, why was this little girl screaming at the top of her lungs? It was because she had to go into this scanner. Doug had been so pleased 5 minutes before about the installation process being seamless, but then he saw one of his end users crying and screaming because she had to interact with his product. Now, I'm hoping that is never the case for any of you, that the users of your websites are crying and screaming, but imagine this. Imagine you're seeing users have this pain. So what did Doug do after experiencing this and being out in the field? What Doug did was he took a step back and he really started trying to understand this little girl and her family. He went to pediatric hospitals. He observed those users in the hospital to see what their pain points and needs were. He started sketching new approaches to this type of product to try to make it a much more seamless, pleasurable experience. Now, what Doug learned on this day, which he hadn't known before he saw that little girl, is that 90% of children who needed to get an MRI scan were needing to be sedated because they were using this MRI scanner and were just too scared and terrified of going in it. Let's see what happened next after Doug spent time understanding his users. We had a redesign of the MRI scanner. You may notice that this picture, the scanner isn't just all white. What are you seeing here? This is the GE Adventure Series MRI scanner. What was the experience that a child and her family would have coming in? When you come to this room, it's an adventure. It's exactly what it sounds like. When you walk into the room, there's aromatherapy in the room. Typically, some of the aroma that they'll use will be pina colada scents. Why do they do that? Think about users. Parents come into this room, they smell a pina colada, and what do they start thinking about? They think about being on the beach, lounging together in a really happy environment. Doug said as he was observing people, they'd walk into the room, smell the pina coladas, and say, "Can we have one?" And unfortunately, the doctors had to say, "Well, we're in the hospital, we're in the scanning room, probably not right now." But you know what else happened? The user in this scenario, the little child, what were they seeing? They were seeing their parents laugh and smiling and thinking about pina coladas. Then what would happen? So before going into the MRI, there was a pirate ship series of GE Adventure Series scanners, and there would be a plank that the little boy or girl would walk up to the scanner. They'd have to literally walk the plank. They'd get into the scanner, and you know what would happen? There would be a huge adventure. You know, there's a pirate series adventure. There's also an adventure series scanner that has fairies in the room. What would the nurse say to the child? They'd say, "Okay, if you stay perfectly still for 5 or 10 minutes, guess what's going to happen? You'll start seeing fairies. If you can't stay still, it won't happen." What would the little children do? They just stay as still as they possibly could. And what would happen? They had an amazing experience. Now, talk about business value. Danny was mentioning that part of the purpose of today is to talk about business impact and business value. Let's not even think about the fact that this was an amazingly pleasurable experience for the users. What Doug found after they instituted the GE Adventure Series, after a year of use, guess what percentage of people and children needed to be sedated? I said it was around 90%. It dropped to less than 1%. It's huge, and it's not even the issue of business value. Think about the type of impact we can have focusing on using research to integrate into our design process. When people ask me why I'm a UX researcher, this is the type of reason. Now, what I want you all to think about, I mentioned, I work at Acquia. Am I working on MRI scanners? No, but I am working on satisfying my users as much as possible so they have this pleasurable experience. The way I think about it is, how can I help make our users feel like they're having like a pina colada on the beach? That's what we're striving for, and this is why we do what we do. Now, I hear a lot of reasons. For those of you who didn't put your hands up in terms of why you're not conducting research, there's a lot of reasons why people don't. What do I typically hear? You don't have enough time. If you start conducting some research, it's going to slow down your development process, and you have tight timelines there. You don't have the staff to conduct research. You don't know where to start, who will do the recruitment. There's so many reasons why not to start. Here's what I wanted to tell you, though. I've spent my entire career teaching development teams how to run their own testing. Testing and research is not rocket science. If you have any of these excuses, another thing that I'll want you to challenge me on is if at the end of the talk you still think these excuses apply. And the reason is, when I think of designers and developers, I think of this guy. I think of us as all being MacGyvers. Does that make any sense? How many of you watched MacGyver back in the 80s? Okay, everyone. Best show on television. And why did we watch it? First, it was a fun show, but what I loved about it is how predictable it was. If you thought about the last 10 minutes of every episode, they were exactly the same scenario, where it would be 8:50, and I'd have to go to bed at 9, and it would be 10 minutes before the end of the show, and MacGyver would be stuck in a room with no materials. There would be a bomb about to detonate, and oh my goodness, what was MacGyver going to do? I can tell you, MacGyver never picked up the phone or looked for a phone to call his manager saying, "I don't have the time and resources to get this done." That's not where he spent his time. Instead, what did MacGyver do? He'd use the resources he had available at the time to get the job done. What did he usually have? He'd have a stick of gum. on him. He'd have his shoes and his shoelaces. And somehow every episode, miraculously, using those tools he had with him, he somehow got out of the jam. That's what I want you to think about. And this is something that I share with my team all the time. It's not about, running state-of-the-art scientific research. It's about using techniques quickly and easily to get the job done, to learn about your users. So when you're thinking about how do I start conducting UX research, my goal today is to show you that you can be like a MacGyver. It doesn't mean you have to bring in 8 to 10 users and have a state-of-the-art usability lab. I mentioned my first test was conducted in 1997. I haven't conducted a test in a usability lab in a good 8 years. And there's a reason for that. Any of you who have ever seen these labs, the way I think of it is a user is in a room by themselves, and there's a voice of God facilitator in the back room giving the user instructions. You don't need to work like that to get the job done. So really thinking about yourself as MacGyvers and how do you work in a lean, quick, and easy way. So why UX research? There's a few themes that I want to share with you. And aligned with the business theme of today, the number one reason is the business impact you can have immediately. Thinking about Doug Dietz at GE, what type of impact does it have when patients are clamoring to use an MRI scanner? They're not having to be sedated. They can just accomplish what they want quickly and easily. How to think about business impact. So I've worked with, in addition to working at Acquia and Carbonite, I spent years and years of my career consulting with organizations thinking about running research. And I saw a theme over and over again that was really surprising to me as I went out. I'd go into organizations that were conducting their own field research and usability testing, and I'd ask, how many people outside of the design and development team are watching the users? And they'd look at me like I was a crazy person to even ask that. I'd ask, is the CEO, is the head of engineering, are there stakeholders from marketing going to the research? And they'd say, no, but we're running a lot of it. An example of this, when I first started at Carbonite as the head of UX, we were running 8 to 10 participants every single week when I came in. And I asked, how are we using that information to inform leadership and our stakeholders' needs? And I got a lot of, we're not, but we're running a lot of tests. Here's the number one thing to think about. If you're running UX research, the only reason to run it is if you're having a strategic business impact. We want to learn about customers, but what's going to give the most value to you and your organization is really understanding what your business problems are, what your organization needs to learn about users, and choosing projects accordingly, thinking about who your stakeholders are. Every project, you'll see some pictures up here. On the left-hand side, there's a picture of me consulting with the team at WebEx. Some of you may have used that web conferencing system. Before any project starts, I sit down with the key stakeholders to get a sense of what their research needs are. Now, when I say key stakeholders, I'm not just saying the developers in the room or the designers in the room. I'm talking about members of engineering, members of marketing, members of sales, to get a good sense of what their research needs are, and involving stakeholders as early as possible. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a picture from Acquia. A few months back, we were redesigning our ticketing system at Acquia. Who's in the room right now? We're prioritizing what they think the biggest problems with our ticketing system are so we can inform what research studies we should do. In the room that day, we had members of support, members of marketing, product managers, engineers, all prioritizing what we thought the biggest problems of our systems were. So in terms of any research studies, start with your stakeholders. Who in the company can tell you where the biggest risks are? Why else do I do this? And why should you always do this? The number one reason to involve your stakeholders beyond knowing what the risks are and what their business priorities are is to avoid the swoop and poop phenomenon. Any of you ever had this happen? Yes. This is something that drives me crazy. When I go into a meeting, whether it's a design meeting, a meeting about development plans, or UX research planning, and some stakeholder, some VP comes into the room after we've put in a lot of work and said, nope, this is absolutely the wrong approach. We're done. We need to revisit. You want to avoid this swoop and poop. How do you do that? By involving them early to understand what their priorities are. So in terms of research, tips to think about. When you're thinking, for half of you in the room who have never conducted a study, it's not about running lots of test participants or lots of studies. It's about quality. Picking one small project where you've talked to stakeholders and they have questions about how users will interact with the designs, and start small. Pick something small. Looking in your organization, if you're having trouble getting buy-in for research, how do you get started? You go around and talk to many of your stakeholders to get an understanding of what their needs are, and pick one of those stakeholders to help for your first study. Who do I pick? It's usually the stakeholder that's already really bought into the power of research. It's the person, when I tell this story about GE, is nodding their head. Yep, they understand that research can really matter. You don't want to start trying to convince people that UX research is mattering to someone who's not at least already bought in a bit. So starting small, picking who your stakeholder is, and getting some wins early on is the place to start. Why am I talking about this before getting into techniques? When I've seen design teams and development teams trying to get started with research, the number one way that it's halted dead in its tracks is if your organization doesn't understand the value. How you get them understanding the value is by involving them early. So, okay. You have buy-in. What are some other techniques for figuring out whether your content is working? What types of studies can you run? The most common approach to evaluating a website by far is web analytics. How many of you are looking at analytics to evaluate? Okay, so pretty much everyone in the room is looking at some sort of quantitative metrics to assess their website. This is a great place to start. Before running any qualitative research, whether it's field research or usability testing, always starting with the web analytics to get an understanding of what users are doing on your website. What you can start looking at, traffic patterns. You can start looking at conversion funnels and where people are falling out of those funnels. Where are people abandoning your site? You can also look at your search engine logs. People ask me a lot of time, how do you get a better understanding of what content is important to your users on your website? One of the first starting places I start is the search engine logs. The reason is, if users are on your website, they typically will scan your site for words that they're looking for. These are their trigger words. These are words that they're hoping will be links on your pages. If they can't find those trigger words, guess what they do? They go right to search. And what do they type in? They type in the words that they wished had been on your page. So that's a great place to start getting feedback. This is the Microsoft.com website. They have millions of pages of content on their site. Starting with web analytics, as we looked at the content, there's some really interesting things to see. Millions and millions of pages of information. And what's interesting is they have product information, they have business software downloads that you can get to, they have all of their games, Microsoft Gaming. You also have hardware that you can access. You can also, see all of the Microsoft Office products. There's links and links and links under the main global navigation. There's an entire downloads marketplace with 20 options in the left-hand navigation that you can click off to. They're alphabetically ordered, which that's something I'd like to talk about. When users come to a website like this, if users don't know what links are in a navigation panel, you know what this is to them? It's random order. So there's 20 links. This is a theme throughout the Microsoft.com site, that there's marketplaces, there's areas for support, there's areas for safety and security. There are hundreds of designers and developers working on this website. What could we learn from the analytics? This is something very interesting. Guess what? So, starting with web analytics, guess what I can tell you by this? There's been hundreds of designers, developers, that Microsoft has hired content strategists to prioritize all of their information. And guess what? Some of these hard-working individuals in-house are working on pages that a user has never seen. So in terms of the theme here is, as you're thinking about your website, as you're thinking about designing your sites and designing content, starting with the web analytics first is key. I spend 90% of my time immersed in qualitative studies, usability testing, and field research. But if I do that without looking at the analytics first, I may not be starting in the right place. So the way I talk about analytics is it's your starting point to get a sense of what people are doing, and just as importantly, what people aren't doing. It's a starting point to get a sense of the landscape, and then you can conduct qualitative studies to complement it. So in terms of thinking about this, and this is very key, starting with web analytics, the answer you're trying to answer is what the answer you're trying to answer. The question you're trying to answer is, what are users doing on my website at a general high level? Why can you only not focus on web analytics? For a very clear reason, that web analytics have limits in terms of what they can share with you. This is the Disney.com website. Have any of you ever been to this website? Matt in the back of the room, one of our designers at Acquia has been. He knows that I bring up Disney.com all the time. And the reason is, I mentioned I started testing websites in 1997. I started testing this site in 2000. And why I love it so much is that it never gets better. That I've tested out this site now with hundreds of users, and I'll give them some of the primary tasks that users want to complete. I have had Disney people in my room for workshops when we test it, and they still haven't improved the UI here. It's great. It's a great example. Why do I bring it up? Testing Disney.com since 2000, I've seen the best performance for Disney was when users could accomplish 42% of the tasks that I gave them. That was the high benchmark there. I don't know what you think about a 42%, but I don't think of that as a good grade. When I got a 42% in school, that was an F. And that's how this site is performing. Here's what you should know about Disney.com. The designers and developers use analytics all the time. They learned something really interesting a couple of years back, which was they started looking at traffic patterns, and they saw that the highest majority of users, close to 90% of users, were going immediately from Disney.com to the Disneyland portion of the site, and were just migrating there. So guess what the designers and developers decided? They said, well, if 90% of our traffic is going to Disneyland, we should invest more effort and all of our effort there. We should invest our resources there. Seems to make perfect sense. But guess what happened? When we brought people into the lab to test this out, what we saw from a qualitative perspective is that users were going to the Disneyland portion of the site all the time. All the time. It was like 90 to 95% of the time. The qualitative research complemented what we learned from the analytics with just one problem. I watched multiple users in the lab on the Disneyland portion of the site just about ready to book a hotel right near Disneyland, not realizing that they were booking a hotel right near Disneyland in California. They were actually trying to go to Disney World. Yeah. I don't do this often in a test, but one of the big keys and a tip I give researchers is always have users complete tasks that they're invested in. So for this study, I brought in real users who were looking to take trips, whether it was to Disneyland and Disney World, and book it while there. This was one of the examples where right before users were hitting, yeah, book, I'd say, no, let's stop. What we saw time and time again is users were going to the Disneyland portion of the site not realizing that they were there. So web analytics can tell you what is happening. What they don't tell you is why, and why users are doing what they're wanting to do. So qualitative research complements the analytics by telling you more about users' intentions, why users are doing what they're doing. So balancing both, I've talked to many design teams and development teams about what's most successful with their UX research programs, and I've been hearing some general themes. What I've heard is that some organizations are spending almost all of their time looking at the web analytics, whereas other organizations aren't looking at the analytics and spend all of their time on the qualitative research, the usability studies and field research. The way to be most successful is not doing that, but balancing both of those needs. Both types of research complement each other. How does this research complement? I mentioned I worked at Carbonite. Interesting statistic we got during my first few months, back to start with a project where you have key business stakeholders with a question to answer. On Carbonite.com, this is a consumer-based product where people are coming to sign up for a free trial to get online backup for $59 a year. Guess what we found out was happening? After people clicked on Start a Free Trial, there was a 50% drop-off throughout the funnel. So by the time people actually had signed up for a free trial, we lost about half of the people who had initially clicked this button. So we had that data, and we wanted to understand why. So we ran a usability study, and we brought in users who were highly invested. We recruited from Twitter, lean recruitment, and we looked for people who were highly interested in online backup, and they were asking whether Carbonite would be right for them. And we brought them into the lab, and we said to them, we'll give you money to buy Carbonite if you decide you'd want to. We basically rigged the experiment here. And what I call this is a compelled shopping study. What do I mean by that? Imagine a scenario. Imagine that you woke up this morning and you wanted a bowl of cereal, and you went into the kitchen and you found your cereal, but you realized that you were out of milk. Now, also imagine that I have some magical contraption that tells me when people run out of milk, and you were out and my contraption beeped, and imagine that I drove to your house. I said, hey, get into my car. I'll drive you to the nearest convenience store, 7-Eleven, and I drive you there, and right before you get out of my car, I give you cash to buy the milk. What is the likelihood that you would actually buy in that scenario, assuming you don't think I'm a crazy person that just showed up at your house? Pretty high, close to 100% conversion. That's what we mirror in the lab. For Carbonite, we had people come who were highly invested in buying the product, and we said, go look for the product that's right for you, and we'll give you the cash to buy. So we brought in Linda, and Linda came to the site, and what happened? She wanted to buy online backup. She came to the homepage, and she looked at this homepage, and she stared. And the reason was, Linda was an independent consultant. She wanted backup for her business, but she saw these two options of home and home office and small business. And the first thing she said is, I don't know which one's right for me. I'll take a guess. So she chose try home free, home and home office. She gets to and enjoy 15 free days of Carbonite form. She thought this was still a seamless experience. She started signing up. She clicked on Start My Free Trial Now, which brought her to a page that doesn't actually let her start my free trial now. She gets a survey. How did you hear about Carbonite? I can tell you we got rid of this eventually, so I'm very happy about that. So she got a survey, bringing her a click away from starting the free trial. She clicks Continue, and she gets to a page that says, Install Carbonite in 3 easy steps. She asked Linda, and this doesn't happen often, she asked if she could use our printer. And the reason was, and I asked her why, she said, I want to print out this page because you're saying this will be an installation in 3 easy steps, but it's not looking very easy to me. So we actually tracked down the printer, we printed it out for her, so she had that. She continued on with Install Now, which brought her to this page. Carbonite is being installed on this computer. What she didn't see was her machine was already also running a security scan. Didn't really notice that. She didn't click on it. She saw this Windows Internet Explorer message that asked her to retry. She clicked the retry button, which got to this page where she saw Carbonite is being installed. Linda was thrilled. This was only 5 easy steps. She was done. I was thrilled too. The test was great. Guess what, though? I had business stakeholders in the back of the room. I had my machine right near me, and I started getting frantic Skypes from our stakeholders where they said, Linda's really excited, but Linda hasn't installed Carbonite on her computer. Nothing's happened. But we told her she had. Now, why is this interesting? Linda went on I told her that she hadn't installed. She then talked to our support team. We then asked her to register for an account, even though she hadn't signed up for Carbonite. This was an arduous 45-minute process. And guess what? Linda, even though I was giving her cash to buy, when I asked her at the end of the session what her impressions were of Carbonite, she said, I'm never coming back. So back to something to think about on your sites, and this is huge. We talk a lot about brand influence and brand impact for our websites. Guess what? The majority of users who came to Carbonite.com initially thought The look and feel was great. The design looked very professional. But guess what happens when users go through an arduous experience trying to complete a task and they can't? Their impressions of your brand plummet. So when you think about priorities, the biggest priorities for users is coming to your site and accomplishing what they wanted to do. No amount of look and feel and brand impressions will help with that. So what happened with Linda? Why was this important, balancing the quantitative with qualitative? We had heard that we had a lot of people dropping off in the installation process. Now we knew why. We looked at the numbers and we saw on just this one screen alone that we were seeing a 30% drop-off. Why was this happening? Part of it was a bug. It wasn't that even participants wanted to drop off. We had a high percentage of users who just didn't know they hadn't installed. This data then, balancing the quantitative and qualitative, went to our senior leadership. And guess what? This was a big win for UX research. So thinking about this, where can you start looking into your analytics, identifying where there may be problems, and bringing in several users to see why? Turns out to work really well, and I can tell you we fixed this, which made me very happy. So there's the business impact. The other big thing that we really want to focus on, thinking about what Doug Dietz was doing at GE, he wanted to improve the experience in design for his users. UX research is one of the best ways to do that. Now, how does that work? Usability testing. Half of you in the room have said you've conducted a test or two. What my main theme is, anyone can conduct a test. You can conduct a test today, this week. It's a quick and easy way to understand how your website is performing, where the problems are, and give you some ideas about how you might address them. Now, usability testing, I talked a little bit about the state-of-the-art usability lab and that people think that it may need to be an arduous scientific process. The way I talk about usability testing at its core is that it's not a science. The goal of testing is not getting to statistical significance. The goal of testing is to watch people interacting with your website, sitting down with them, and seeing what they do. That's all at its core. If any of you have ever sat beside someone who's part of your target audience and seen them struggle, you ran a usability test. That's all it takes. You can run tests anywhere. I mentioned I think I lied a little. I said I haven't tested in a lab in 8 years. I think it's more like 6. This is a really ugly picture I took, but this is the Cisco usability lab. So they do have a one-way mirror, and they have users in the other room. I insisted that as the facilitator that I not be in this back room. I was sitting right beside the user watching them work. And that's all you have to do. This is a picture. You'll see Leah Reifus around this week. This is a picture of her conducting a usability testing with one of our VPs of engineering at Acquia. Another clever trick. Usability testing doesn't always have to be with your actual users. This was the first week of a project where we wanted to get some initial internal feedback and buy-in. So we ran a usability test in a conference room with some of our stakeholders so they could see how the interaction works. It's very quick and dirty, but also very effective. You can do testing in coffee shops. One of my biggest positives where I like to focus on testing is at conferences. I call these trade show tests. You are all my participants, hopefully. My goal would be, we're at our booth and sitting down with all of you, if we're trying to improve Acquia.com, I'll go to Drupal camps. Last year at Bad Camp, I had a portion of our booth allocated to just talking to developers, having them come over for 15 minutes. I gave them a few key tasks, and I saw how they did. So if you're hesitant to run a research study, think about it this way. Can you take one person in the room at Design for Drupal and take them aside for 10 minutes and ask them to complete some main tasks with your product and see what they do here? It turns out that it's a really, really highly effective way to get feedback quickly and easily. So running a test session, it's very, very simple. There's really, at its core, only 5 steps. So if you've never run a test, here's what you need to think about. Your user comes in, and if the user is at Design for Drupal, you greet them. You tell them what they can expect from the test, that you'll give them a series of tasks to complete, that you're not evaluating them, you're evaluating your website, and their feedback will help you improve that website. And you give them basically the protocol and explain to them how the test will work. So there's the greeting, you say hello, then you explain how the test will work and what they'll have to perform, and then you give users tasks to complete, and you stay quiet for the most part, and you watch them work. And the goal is to start seeing, as users are completing tasks with your site, where are the problems? I get a lot of questions about what tasks to start with. There's a couple of areas. You want to focus on areas that you know are highly important to the business, that the website work. In the case of Microsoft.com, I probably wouldn't start with tasks where no users have ever accessed the pages. You'd want to start with important portions of your site, and you'd also want to look at portions where you have very little knowledge of how users interact with your website, areas where you don't know very much. That's what I call levels of risk. At the end of the test session, I'll have a general question and answer with the user. I always ask for any test session, whether it's at a conference like this or a more formal test, 2 questions. One is, what are the two things you liked most about the website? The goal of asking that question is not to take that feedback and massively redesign your site. The goal is to leave the session on a high note, where the participant gets to say something positive. If you have observers who are part of the development team watching, they hear something positive. The second question I ask will be, what are the 2 things you'd most like to see improved with the website? When I ask that, it helps me prioritize what problems we might want to address first. And then at the end, I debrief with any observers. I get a lot of questions about who should be observing test sessions. Anyone in your company who has an influence on what your website's design will be. I involve all of them. It's developers, it's marketing professionals, it's sometimes members of the legal team. It's anyone within your company who can help inform your product or website. So that's testing in a nutshell. I'm asked a lot for what you should look for as you're watching users through testing. There's a few key signs of user behaviors that you should always be looking out for. The first sign that I mention all the time is when users click the back button on your site. I have a nickname for the back button. Many of you may have heard me say this last year at Design for Drupal. I call the back button the button of doom. And there's a clear reason for this, that looking at click streams as users traverse websites, if users click the back button just once when users are traversing sites, the likelihood that they'll eventually find what they want is around 18%. If users click the back button twice as they're going through trying to complete a task, that number plummets to 2%. This is not a good sign. Another key indicator of failure is a behavior known as pogo sticking. Did any of you have one of those evil contraptions when you were young? I could not use it. You jump up and down on the pogo stick. I could jump up 4 or 5 times, and then I just get frustrated. Pogo sticking is the same phenomenon online. The thought behind this is, have you ever been on a page where you've been presented with a list of links? And when you look at those links, you don't know which one is right for you to choose? What do? You take a guess. You pick one. If you don't find what you want on the next page, you click the back button, and then you take another guess. If you don't find what you want there, you click the back button. And pogo sticking is jumping up and down the hierarchy of your website, looking for your content, and not being able to find it. When users pogo stick, it's a clear sign that you're not driving users to the information that they need effectively. Search. If users go to your search box immediately when they come to your website, it's a clear sign that there's something awry. Now, people will raise their hand and say, hey, I go to Amazon.com all the time and go to search. So what's the problem? You'll want to think about whether your site is in Amazon.com. Think about Amazon. So Amazon, think about it. When you go there, I typically go there, and if I'm looking for a book, I don't type book into the search engine. That wouldn't be totally effective for me. What do? I type in the specific book I want, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, something like that. It's uniquely identified content that only one thing will be returned from the search engine if I enter that. If your site has content like Amazon, where people know exactly what they're looking for, the search engine's okay. If you have sites where there's more general content, if users are going to the search engine, it's a sure sign that your links and your navigation aren't getting people to what they want. Same thing with FAQs. If users have to go to FAQs, it's clear that you're not answering their questions in the first place, and they need to go somewhere else to get it. It's a clear sign of failure. I said that testing doesn't have to be an arduous science. Testing can be really, really quick. Testing can take 5 seconds. And I want to show you how this works. This is a technique, if you're one of those 50% of you have never run a test, my request of you is to try one of these here at Design for Drupal. If it takes 5 seconds, you don't really have an excuse not to. I'll be watching. I really won't. Okay, so let's do one. So the idea behind a 5-second page test, rather than lecturing about it, let me show you how it works. The goal is, if you have pages on your site, content pages, where you want to understand whether users can assess all of the valuable content there, specifically, do users see what the primary purpose of the page is? The 5-second page test is great. So let me show you how it works. It's just like any other usability test. You bring users in, you have them interact with your site, and you ask them some questions. So here's the task that I want you to think about. I want you to imagine the scenario that you want to post pictures online from your last vacation. You're concerned that this is the first time you're picking a service to post online, and you're concerned that the upload process will be super arduous. So when you go to this website, I'm going to bring it up for just 5 seconds, a specific content page. What I want you to do during that 5 seconds is pay attention to all of the content you can see on the page. Then what I want you to think about is, what is the most important piece of content? Are you ready? I cheated a little bit there too. It was like 4 seconds. What did you see there? I'll get a lot of, First, what site was it? PhotoBucket. Okay, some of you saw that. I guarantee, I've now run this test with thousands of developers and designers. I don't even really need to ask, but what we typically see is people say they have no idea what the most important piece of content on that page was, that there's a lot of text and a lot of gibberish, but they didn't know it was there. The one thing people can say is that they knew it was PhotoBucket. So let me give you the same task, but on a different site for 5 seconds. What site was that? What were some of the big pieces of content that you noticed? Get started. Anything else that really stuck out beyond what PhotoBucket was doing? Google. Okay, what else? Photos. There's a lot of things here. My question for you is, in just that 5 seconds, which would you say, and this is just a quick vote, how many would say that you feel most confident quickly and easily uploading with PhotoBucket based on what you saw? How many of you would say Picasa? Okay. Thing to know about those two sites, when asking the designers of both of those teams what the primary purpose was of those content pages, both of those teams said the primary purpose was to show how quickly and easily you can upload with Picasa. Now, why did we do this? In a 5-second test, I have a wealth of information that I could bring back to the PhotoBucket team to tell them what they could do better. And I could also, tell the Picasa team that they're doing a pretty good job of communicating the main piece of information. It takes 5 seconds. Another goal of UX research, bringing up Doug Dietz again. I talked about the business value of research. One of the big takeaways, when I come into organizations, when I first came into Acquia and I first came into Carbonite, we didn't start with a lot of usability testing. We started with field research. And the reason was, think about what happened to Doug Dietz when he was in the hospital watching people interact with his MRI scanner. What happened there? He realized immediately that his product was not satisfying the needs of the users. It really led to a lot of empathy on the part of him and his team to make change and invest in change. In terms of building empathy, there's nothing better than UX research. At every company that I've started at, we start here. We go out into the field, we watch users in their natural environment, and we see how they do work. Many of you will meet Matt Edmonds, who's in the back of the room. He's one of our senior UX designers at Acquia. This is not Acquia's office up front. We're out with one of our clients to learn more about how the customer is working with Drupal specifically. We talked to content authors, developers, designers, not just talked. We sat back in their environment for half a day and just stayed quiet and watched them work. We're in essence acting like Sigourney Weaver. We just sat back and observed. Why did we do this? We learned a ton about how the users were working with our products, but just as importantly, we learned a ton about who these people were and what their motivations were. At the top of the screen, that's Matt with one of our product managers, the product manager where this organization was working with this product. We got to see all of their pain points. We got to see a content author have cheat sheets all over her desk because she couldn't get Drupal to work in the way she needed. She was taking 20 steps to complete something that, frankly, we hoped could be 4 or 5. Guess what happens when our teams go out into the field? They start talking about who these people are. It's huge. Now, in terms of thinking about ethnography, there's a lot of thought that takes a ton of work. It takes half a day of your time going out and watching your customers. That's all. It's really lean. It's really cheap. Now, in terms of thinking about ethnography, what should you think about? The thing that I tell people all the time is go in with no preconceived notions of how your customers work. You're going in as the apprentice. You're just trying to see how they go about doing their job. Now, you're focusing on the customer and the person, not the product. What works best about going out for ethnography is it's not about testing out the product. It's about seeing how your users work on a day-to-day basis and seeing where their pain points are. You'll hear a lot this week about innovation around design. How do you get to innovation? It's by understanding your users' pain points and finding where those gaps are and solving those needs for them. Big thing. I can't tell you how many times I've gone out with newbie researchers where they'll go out to customers and they'll tell them about a new feature and ask a question like, well, we're going to release this feature soon. Do you like it? What do you think customers say back? They go, yes, sounds great. I can't tell you how many teams I've worked with who will prioritize a roadmap based on that type of research. Ugh. What I'd suggest, users don't know what they want in the future. That's your job as developers and designers to figure that out. When we go out for ethnography, it's not about asking users what they want for a future design. It's about seeing their problems so you can design something for them that will satisfy their needs. Keeping questions open, open-ended questions. If you ask any questions that can only end with a yes or no, that's not a good question. Instead, you want to ask questions about, tell me about your day. You know, where are you spending the bulk of your time? Open-ended questions so you can learn more about users and their workflow. So that's empathy, knowing your customers. There's also learning quickly. We talked about 5-second tests. I said that you can test right here this week. That's a quick way to learn. At Acquia and at Carbonite, and this is something I saw topics over the next couple of days that will be excellent. We are conducting research all the time. It's not always with users for testing or ethnography. It's sometimes conducting research with internal stakeholders. There's a couple of techniques that we're using all the time quickly and early on products. Those techniques are, what you see up here is sketching. In the first couple of weeks of any project, instead of, how many of you have spent hours and hours in requirements planning meetings trying to decide what your website should be? I despise those meetings just because there's so many opinion wars. Instead of spending your time in those meetings, one of the best techniques you can use is conducting research early and ideating with your internal stakeholders. What do I mean by that? This is a picture at Acquia where we brought in all of the subject matter experts who have information to help inform what a product offering would be. And instead of sitting in a room discussing what the offering would be, we ran what's known as a design studio, where every stakeholder in the room spends 15 to 20 minutes sketching out what they think the future vision of the website should be or the product should be. They share those brainstorms with the rest of the group. We critique those brainstorms, and then we do it again, and we iterate. We continue to do this not to come up with a final solution, but to conduct research. One of the biggest design problems, if not the biggest design problems, when you release something that doesn't work for users, one of the biggest reasons why is that an internal stakeholder in the company wasn't given the ability to share information that they knew about the users or the product. If there's one thing you can do, having early stage sketching, these early stage design studios, with the goal of not having a final design, but getting all of the key stakeholders in your room telling you what they'd envision for a product design and website design, gives you a wealth of information about their knowledge of users. We do this technique as much as possible at the beginning of a new project. Another great technique to use, any of you run paper prototype testing? A couple of you. Excellent, excellent resource for you, an excellent book by Carolyn Snyder, coincidentally enough, called Paper Prototyping. The goal behind this is, in the first couple of weeks of design, putting your design and your interaction flows on paper. You see a quote up here where I was teaching a course on design and interaction design, and one of the techniques I suggested was building your design on paper and building the interactions. And the response I got from an attendee was, we're building a what with what? Like, why would we possibly build a design that's an interactive design on paper? It turns out it's an excellent way in the first couple of weeks of development to map out what you think the interaction flows are and see how users might interact with them. How does a paper prototype test work? Basically, your team will work as the computer. That you bring in users, you have them interact with paper, you tell them where would you click, they point to where they'd click in the interface, and you can start seeing very quickly where there may be flows and gaps in terms of the interaction flows you created. Getting this early ideation, I think of this, any sort of early stage sketching, as UX research. It's not about the final design, it's about gathering information about your users. And finally, and this is huge, where UX research can be incredibly valuable. One of the big excuses for not doing research that I mentioned at the beginning was getting stakeholder buy-in. The way you get stakeholder buy-in, and I've had, back in my past life as an external consultant, so many people come to me and say, can you come in and present and get my VP of engineering excited about research? And my response is absolutely not. And the reason isn't not that I don't love presenting, but no amount of someone coming in and just evangelizing research will get your stakeholders on board. What gets them excited about research is if you can immerse them. So back to what I said, involving stakeholders early, getting their research questions. At Acquia, we have something that's known as SURF, which stands for Super User Research Fridays. What is the goal of this? Do we have it every week? No, we hope to have it every week, but the goal is, guess what? Everyone in the company knows that Friday is the day for research. If they want to see how customers interact with our products, that's when it's going to happen. At Carbonite, we called this day Earth, for User Research Thursday. We were just like super creative. So thinking about having weekly research sessions, what you see here is a surf day where this is developers from Acquia's cloud platform team watching sessions. We also have one of the heads of support watching. Getting your team involved in seeing customers is the way to get buy-in. For any research study we run, I am not taking notes in my little static way. I get the entire team involved. If the one tip you can think about is if you're running a usability test and you don't have an observer, then you're missing out. In terms of what we have here, as I was moderating a test, we had observers from the UX team, the engineering team, the product team, taking notes on the wall of problems they identified from the study. Guess how powerful it is if one of your stakeholders is the one writing on the flip chart those notes. Great way to lead to collaboration is through research. Finally, this is at Carbonite. This is a research presentation. We ran the study, and instead of sending out a report that's 20 pages long, what we do is meet with the engineering team and other key stakeholders once a month to present our findings. This was the UX team area. People just knew a presentation would happen, and you know what else I'd do? I'd buy them lunch. They'd show up, but it leads to collaboration and buy-in. The way you'll get your team involved is by immersing them in the research. So why did I share all of this? I shared a lot of techniques. I shared some reasons why you might want to run research. What it comes down to, and I started with this, what is the end goal for UX research? It's not about running usability tests or running field studies or running these 5-second tests. It's not about the techniques. It's about the end goal, which the end goal is thinking about Doug Dietz and the Adventure Series MRI. Remembering I told you a child was screaming at the top of her lungs? What happened after they redesigned and learned from the research is that he went back for another field study with his team. And guess what the child said after the MRI scan? It makes me tingle. And the reason is, I mentioned the business value that fewer than 1% of children we're asking now to be sedated in parents. It's that the children want to come back because it was such a great day. Think about that. If you have users, like with my team and at Acquia, we're thinking all the time, we're not here, admittedly, but how do we get here? So throughout this week, as you're thinking about the conference, what I encourage you to do is think about, with all of these techniques you're learning about, how do you get to this level? It's huge. So in terms of thinking about things, just keeping in mind, starting small, learning about your customers, starting early. If just one of you conducted a 5-second page test this week, that would be a huge win for me. We're all, as a team and as an organization, trying to get where GE is, so I wish you all luck with that. So that's what I came to talk to you about today.